Today is August 22nd, 2024. This is episode 42 of the In a Nutshell podcast. I'm your host, Sean Vowells, and with me, as usual, is Joe Meade. Tonight, Joe and I will finish our Big Ten football preview, which includes the 9 teams formerly in the Big Ten West, and then the 2 schools that are coming into the conference from Los Angeles. So, Joe, we've got the death of the Big Ten West. We did talk about it for a while. We're talking about all those teams tonight, none of which really met their expectations last year. The divisions are over. Is it good news or bad news for these football clubs?
I will put it to you this way, Sean. I don't think expectation-wise there'll be much bad news should we come back to this episode in the middle of December. What I will say is we're having a lot different conversations tonight about where teams will end up and where they're expecting to end up. And this isn't really ripping these programs. I think this is going to be a theme we see throughout the country, especially in college football, which is the most non-equal sport, especially if the two we cover on Sports Daily CBB between basketball and football. So, if you don't like talking about bowl eligibility and, having a highlight season with 8 or 9 wins, you might like yesterday's episode or our previous episode a lot better. So we would not lie to you here. But I think a lot of intriguing storylines, Sean. I do think, especially one of the teams we'll cover, there's a lot more scenarios for these teams, which makes it more fun, and it makes more of an opportunity for me to look like an idiot in 2 months, or maybe even in a month, when one of these teams inevitably performs way above or way below expectations. So here we go.
We got a lot on the line for a number of these coaches this year who, multiple have had very, very mixed bags so far in their tenures at their schools, and this year could move the needle, whether it's going to be a firing soon or what's going to be ending up to be a good hire. So, Joe, it is the same sort of thing yesterday. For the viewers, we'll throw the schedules up, we'll go through them, we'll go through the expectations, and then we'll move on to the next team. So today, we are going to start with the Purdue Boilermakers. Hudson Card is back at quarterback again. I'd say an average to above average year for him last year, and the first time he's really got all the starts. They do have a really premier non-conference game early on, Joe, against the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. They play Indiana State first. They get a road game against Oregon State, but a tough start to the year for the team that finished in last in the Big Ten West last year.
Sean, I think what's been more of the Purdue narrative since Ryan Walters has taken over there is the recruiting. The recruiting's really picked up in the offseason, and this is not a deflection to what we're going to inevitably talk about, which is their team this year. But Sean, they've been winning battles, and they've been in battles with Penn State, Michigan, and winning them, much to the dismay of the bluer bloods in the conference. So I think Ryan Walters is laying a good foundation. I do think last year is not held against him by anybody. I think the only ridiculous thing he did was make an unnecessary enemy out of the team that runs this conference, which is the Michigan Wolverines, after the sign stealing thing. But that was mainly a joke to some of the people with lighter views on that. What I think this year is, I think with this schedule, Sean, I don't know how you see improvement in the record, and I don't think that's the most fair gauge in judging this team. Sean, you play 4 top 10 teams, 4 top 8 teams as of right now, which is beyond hard. We were talking about Michigan's schedule yesterday. 3 of the top 4. I think 4 of the top 8 or half of the top 8 is pretty ludicrous, wouldn't you say?
Well, especially considering 3 of them are in conference. Now, I don't know if we specifically referred to it yesterday, but we've said it really in all sports and in these new mega conferences. Teams don't really have to go out of their way to schedule tough in the non-conference, whether it's in basketball or football, just because there's so many tests in the conference. They go out, they add Notre Dame, which they certainly didn't have to do. Now, this agreement, it could have been made years ago when there was no talks of super conferences yet, but it's just unnecessary for a team, to me, I think, to go out and get a Notre Dame. It is at home. It is you're rebuilding as a team. I think we could see some improvements across the board from this Purdue team, but like you said, Joe, the wins losses record, it's going to be really tough to improve on that because they have, like you said, four, almost certain losses on that schedule. Now, if they win one of them, then maybe we're the whole season could be different, but they have a number of their tough games at home, the Nebraskas, the Oregons, the Penn States, the Notre Dames, and then they also have a couple of teams that we expect at least to be in the middle of the pack on the road. So, we talked about some candidates for last place yesterday. Just from the schedule alone, Joe, I think Purdue might be headed there again.
I think it's definitely possible. One thing I want to highlight is Dylan Tiananmen at safety. They did bring in two DBs from Georgia, Nyland Green being one of the more prominent ones. I think this roster is much better than last year's Purdue team. What I think is going to unfortunately hold them back, aside from the schedule, is the timing of a lot of these games. I mean, that gauntlet between October 18th and November 16th, that's a month where the only game they might be favored to win is Northwestern, which is you could get tickets as low as $9 according to ESPN plus fees. So if you're a Purdue fan that really wants to see a win, that might be the day. But I circle Friday, October 18th, 8 p.m. We talked about yesterday, and I know I got DM'd about it a few times today regarding how, that Pac-12 team's going to run into a mid or a even bad Big Ten team on a certain given night or day. Friday, October 18th, 8 p.m. on Fox. That could be a candidate. I don't think so. But if all chaos breaks loose, that would be the first candidate right there for the spoiler makers to reappear. I know that was a trademark under Jeff Brom. Perhaps Ryan Walters continues the tradition in year two. But, Sean, anything above 5 wins or improving upon that 4-8 record last year, I think would be a massive success with all the momentum you've had. Ryan Walters not shy to use the portal as seen by this offseason. And obviously Hudson Card there too from last offseason. So Purdue's in a good position overall. I do like where they're going. I think this is a house money year as much as sitting at home in December might stink for them. I think that this is a year they can kind of scratch off if they don't do well. So I think they should just go out there. And Ryan Walters, probably pressure-wise, has still the least amount in this conference, which is pretty surprising to say.
Off the top of my head, Joe, I'm not super familiar with how Oregon State is slated to be this year. I know they were ranked last year, and that game is on the road. But off the top of my head, Purdue might be favored in 2 games this year. That would be the opener against the Sycamores, and then Northwestern at home, maybe. The other teams in and around them, they're playing on the road, like the Illinois, like the Michigan States, like the Indianas. I see 2 games where they're favored this year, and that is definitely scary from a wins-loss point of view. But maybe they can surprise us. But tough going for year 2 at Purdue for Coach Walters, because we saw a couple really tough ones yesterday, but this is the first tough one of a team that we don't expect to be really good. So could see a number of L's for the Boilermakers this year. Now we're going to move on, Joe, to one of the newcomers in the conference. That is UCLA. They come over from the Pac-12. Chip Kelly is gone. He is still in the conference, but he is no longer the coach of the Bruins. They do promote from within. They have a crazy amount of turnover between the staff and the players. They were pretty solid in a great Pac-12 last year, but with all this major turnover, where should the expectations be for the Bruins?
Frankly, I don't think their fan base cares. I'll be really upfront with you. I think if any UCLA, if you tracked in a weird FBI kind of way the activity on the average UCLA sports fan's phone, I bet it was baseball in the beginning period after March Madness. Then it immediately went back to UCLA basketball and the activity they've had of people coming in and out, which we'll cover again in our other segments. But very little good news this offseason. You had Chip Kelly jump ship. You had Dante Moore, who mysteriously went there. I'm still in disbelief at that saga, which we could cover another time. So Ethan Garber is probably going to start at QB. I really don't know what to make of that. I think he's fine. I think they've lost so much. I think Deshaun Foster, his heart and head is in the right place. I just think he was left in probably one of the most precarious positions you could ever be in, especially in the modern era. Coach leaves you middle of the offseason, proceeding to enter the toughest conference, if not the second toughest conference in all of college football. And you're probably picked anywhere 16th to 18th. Yikes.
Yeah, we talked about it yesterday, Joe, of one of the new teams. I'm forgetting which one. That they don't really have to run the gauntlet of pure, ugly Big Ten football. I think that might be the case for the Bruins here. Looking at the halfway point on, they get Minnesota, Rutgers, Nebraska, Iowa. I mean, it doesn't get more Big Ten than that. Especially a road or a home game against Iowa on Friday, some road games on Saturday once it starts to get cold. Nebraska could be cold. New Jersey certainly could be cold in the middle of October. So they are going to be introduced to the Big Ten right away. They have a tough non-conference game against LSU, which is on the road. Then they start Big Ten play with Oregon and then Penn State. So, that first game against Indiana is at home. You'd like to think that they could certainly win that game, but after that, Joe, they're getting everything that the Big Ten has to handle early and often here.
Sean, I made this point yesterday about how that could be an important game for Indiana. This is an important game for UCLA, and not even in terms of bowl eligibility, in terms of not finishing, bottom 20% of this conference, and bottom 20% of this conference would mean like anywhere 15 to 18. And I think UCLA would very much prefer to stay out of that. A lot of people are projecting they will definitively be there, whether that's 16 or 18. I could not tell you. So, Sean, I think UCLA, record-wise, what you have to do, you have to win the realistic games. I'm looking at Hawaii, and even that game on the road at Hawaii, I hate that so much.
Yeah.
Even though California is a lot closer to Hawaii than all these other states.
It's still Hawaii, as far away as California is. Rutgers.
Yeah.
It's as far away as Rutgers is.
Hawaii, Indiana, Minnesota. Even Rutgers isn't that realistic a win. Maybe you pick off what I'm saying, Sean, is there's probably 3 games I would favor them in right now if I were Vegas.
The first, the second, and the last being Fresno State. And that's, again, sort of the same tune with Purdue. You could see this going bad, but do they really care if they see some positives in some places? I don't think so. I think they will take I don't know if they would take a 3-win season, but if you have 3 wins, you see some improvements, you get your coach off the ground in the new conference, and I don't think they'll be too disappointed about that.
Well, based on what's happened at UCLA post-COVID, I am convinced they do not care. And sure, they've coupled in win against USC, and I do want to give some credit to Chip Kelly. He did a pretty respectable job there. He had them pretty close in 2022 to being a New Year's Six team at times. I mean, it totally fell off the rails at the end. But Sean, I don't think UCLA will be playing meaningful football in November, at least for a few more years. I think by October, fans are just going to be looking forward to basketball if they've been paying attention at all. I'm more curious to see how empty the Rose Bowl is this year for Indiana, for Minnesota, and I bet you Iowa and Oregon go there, and it's 60% of those fans. Because, no offense to Iowa, I don't see them going back to the Rose Bowl in a pretty long time, but I could be wrong, so who knows?
So, could be, typical basketball school, very similar to Purdue. Early life for UCLA in the Big Ten on the football side might be rather difficult. So we'll move on to Minnesota up next, Joe. PJ Fleck back for another year in charge. They do have a new quarterback from the transfer portal, a team that certainly showed some signs last year. They knocked off Iowa on the road. But do you think they have what it takes to not get stuck in the middle this year?
I think it all relies on that new quarterback you just mentioned, Sean, Max Prosper from New Hampshire. Number 1 in FCS in passing and total offense. I think a lot of people like to rail on the FCS. Certainly, I'm not going to pretend that I watch it a lot, nor is any average college football fan. what I can tell you is they put plenty of respectable players in the NFL, and leading the FCS in total offense as the most important position in all of sports is nothing necessarily to make light of. With that said, Sean, I do like PJ Fleck. I do think Minnesota is one of the more consistent programs from the old Big Ten West. What I mean by that is they rarely disappoint majorly. Last year might have been one of the few times where Gopher fans were a little upset with PJ. Definitely not hot seat talk at all. I think people who say that he is on one this year are more clickbait merchants than anything. Sean, I'm going to be real honest here. I see a situation where Minnesota necessarily doesn't contend for a playoff spot. They could surprise a lot of people, and they're over under right now, Sean. For I misquote it is. Just gonna get this up. Over under. Oh, that's the Vikings over under. I was about to like laugh my butt off at that. Yeah, certainly won't be over 7.5, but 5.5 as of right now, Sean. So I think I think getting over that would appease people, but getting 7 or 8 massively going over is potentially on the table. I know you look at the 4 ranked games, but Iowa at home, USC, and Penn State, 3 of your 4 road games are at home. And I don't think Michigan, whether that was home or away, Minnesota fans would give much of a chance to win either way. So, what do you think with all that thrown at you, Sean?
I think they're probably, and for those who didn't listen yesterday, I think they're probably a step behind Rutgers. And we saw, we talked yesterday about how we think Rutgers is pretty solid, maybe not, college football playoff solid, but potentially, getting 8, 9 wins, maybe sneaking into the top 25. I think Minnesota's just a step behind that. I think if they can get to 7-5 or thereabouts, they will be pretty happy with that. Now, it is rather tough schedule. You do have a couple of road games against the middle of the pack teams like UCLA, Illinois, Rutgers, Wisconsin. I mean, those teams are all going to be in the middle of the pack except for maybe UCLA. So if you can win one of those, you can win your home games. Maybe Minnesota can be, I guess maybe stuck in the middle isn't such a bad thing for the Golden Gophers this year because there are so many teams, and 5-4 could be 6th place. We never know, but I think they're a little step behind Rutgers in the fact maybe a year behind the Scarlet Knights, who are definitely trying to kick the doors down in the top 25. I think they're probably a year away from that.
Yeah, Sean, I do think it's amazing how PJ Fleck kept Darius Taylor not only at Minnesota. I think that's an accomplishment in and of itself. Being a true freshman running back from the state of Michigan, was one of their better players last year. You didn't even hear a word about him looking at the portal, which I find amazing. So I do want to credit that there. I think if Brosmer is as dual threat and as exciting as Minnesota insiders expect him to be, they're not saying he's going to win the Heisman per se, but he's probably going to be something at quarterback Athen Kallick, Manasusa, or Rutgers right now couldn't even come close to offering. So does that give some teams some trouble like at Iowa, USC? I certainly think so.
It's certainly a different flavor of football
Right.
than the Big Ten West. Like, we've seen teams run the ball into the ground, like have a little bit of dynamic quarterback play. Other teams haven't seen that in a while. Even if you talk about the good quarterbacks in the Big Ten last year, the J.J. McCarthy's and the, nobody was really like a gunslinger. So if you can do something like that, now the Pac-12 teams, that was basically their entire conference. So disregard those teams, but I think quarterback play could definitely give Minnesota a different look, and these other teams might not see that very often.
Yeah, Sean, with that said, I think what defines success for Minnesota, I think the bare minimum would be get back to another bowl game. And I know last year they were in one, but they were 5-7. I think kind of like Michigan State, if you get out of this first 6 game stretch, you win the first 3, and North Carolina's not easy season opener that will be played next week either. If you get out of that opening stretch though 3-3, you give yourself a lot of breathing room, not only to make a bowl game, but probably to get 8 wins. I think it's possible you win 5 of the last 6. I think the only game you might not be totally favorite in is a Penn State, maybe a Wisconsin or Rutgers, depending on how those seasons go by November. So I think Minnesota could be have the potential to pull off some of these upsets. In particular, I'm looking at Iowa, I'm looking at USC, and I'm looking directly at Penn State as well, depending on how their season is up to that point. Just because this dynamic offense, it's something PJ hasn't had a chance to play around with. I know they do lose Joe Rossi on defense, but I trust that the unit's gonna hold itself up, and if the offense could be effective by September, I only expect them to get even better by the time October and November roll around.
Yeah, I think of this season in two parts for Minnesota: the three non-con games and then the three ranked conference games. If they can get 3 wins in those six, you certainly would like their chances to get 3 more wins in the remaining six. So that's how I think Minnesota has to look at it if they want to hold serve and remain bowl eligible. And 6 wins is certainly a step up from last year's 5. We'll move on to Northwestern, Joe. Now, last year, Northwestern went through about as much as any college football team ever has in a year. They lose their coach before the year. We pretty much wrote them off. Whatever happens that isn't a terrible loss was a positive for the Wildcats, and they actually did all right, all things considered. Now, you get a proper offseason for their coaching staff. Now, the stadium is a different story, but with so much turmoil last year, it's got to be, just good for Northwestern football just to have a real season here.
Yeah, Sean, I think it's kind of actually in a way pretty strange because after the offseason last year, Northwestern probably could not have had a better realistic season
Yeah.
than they had.
We talked about them winning 0 games before the
Yeah.
season started. Now they ended up doing much better than that.
Yeah, I think David Braun rightfully won a lot of Coach of the Year awards, whether they were legit or off websites. I certainly would have given it to him if I could have bought a $20 uh, trophy from Walmart. But in all seriousness, Sean, I think it's an interesting addition this offseason. Mike Wright will most definitely be the starter. Maybe they haven't made it official quite yet, but it all it is all but official. With that said, Sean, I think their biggest loss on the offensive side, you're losing Cam Johnson, not great. With all the negative, I mean, that's really all the main negative part for the receiving core. Bringing back A.J. Henning and bringing back a Bryce Kurtz, your second and third leading wide receivers. I do think that gives Mike Wright some comfortability and the team some comfortability with their playmaking. A.J. Henning certainly showed glimpses of that at Michigan and into last year. Bryce Kurtz as well, always a reliable option. In terms of schedule, Sean, I'm not going to lie to you at all. I think this is one of the lighter schedules we've seen of any team.
Yeah, non-conference, they should not be challenged. 3 home games against Miami, Ohio, Duke, and Eastern Illinois. You'd like to think they're stepping onto the field in Washington on September 21st, 3-0. And then you look at, that there's a chance that this team can win a number of games this year. I really think that and prove that last year wasn't a fluke. Now they do get Michigan and Ohio State towards the end of the year, and those teams certainly won't be wanting to drop that game, especially with potential college football playoff spot on the line. But I like Northwestern not challenging themselves early on. To be honest with you, they keep stacking wins, keep you get some Big Ten games there early on where you think that they'd have a decent chance of winning, and I certainly could see them being 6-2, 5-3 early on, and really having a good season.
Yeah, Sean. And one thing that's pretty interesting is just as a bigger conference theme. Everyone's going to highlight the Wisconsin Alabama game, which we'll talk about, Michigan, Texas, and LSU USC as the premier non-conference games. I think Northwestern, Duke, and Minnesota UNC, while those won't be playoff teams, any of those four, they do provide an insight to the middle ground of this conference, or even the bottom half of the middle class, as we'll call them. So I think these games are a lot more important in terms of the context for everyone involved, just to draw some interest into Northwestern and Minnesota, considering you're probably not going to watch them on the average Saturday. Sean, I think building off last year in any way, which would probably be making a bowl game or even improving upon that 7-win regular season total, would be a massive success. And with the weapons they have back, particularly Kurt's Henning, I know they like Calvin Johnson the second a lot, and no, I don't think he's related to Megatron. There is a pretty decent chance, Sean, they could be bowl eligible maybe by the time November rolls around. The only game I really see them losing in their first 8 games is, a game to Iowa, a game at Washington. Certainly Maryland and Wisconsin are going to be pretty challenging, but Northwestern's kind of had Wisconsin's number relative of relative to most of their history. So I don't think they'll be going scared into any of their first 8 games, to be fair, Sean.
Yeah, they really, if I remember correctly, they really beat down Wisconsin on the road last year, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And, they have the return game against Duke. They went there last year. Duke was certainly much better last year, and that was early on in the year. But Northwestern could be one of the biggest momentum teams that we see. And if they get rolling again and, their home stadium, which is, basically a bunch of propped up bleachers because their actual stadium's under construction, this could be another interesting season for Northwestern. Now, I don't know if like a 6-win or 5-win season's necessarily that much of a step back, but I do think retaining bowl eligibility would be a huge step in the right direction for Northwestern.
I completely agree, Sean.
All right, we'll move on to the next team, potentially one with the most interesting headline in the sport, really, and that's the Nebraska Cornhuskers. Matt Rule is back for another season, and Joe, 5-star quarterback Dylan Raiola, the true freshman, is going to be starting for them against UTEP in Week 1. Nebraska, their expectations are sky high. Their fan support is sky high. Expectations will always be high. Do they have a chance of meeting them this year?
Well, it depends what kind of expectations we're talking, because you'll read Twitter and you'll find out that they have to be 7-0, not should be, which I think there's a difference, have to be 7-0 when they go into Columbus on October 26th, which has the potential to be a night game. Certainly if they're undefeated, I think the networks will do anything they can to make that possible. I think pretty immediately you're going to find out what this team is about and how the fan base is going to react. Now, does that mean they're not going to pack Husker Stadium or Memorial Stadium every Saturday? No. But Colorado, under the lights on NBC 7:30, in terms of viewership, I think that will rival. It might rival Michigan, Texas on the same day. That's no joke. You got Deion Sanders going in there, Coach Prime, Shador, rematching with Nebraska, which is one of their more
Colorado
hostile
beat
games
them
last
pretty
year.
solidly last year. So Nebraska's they're not going to want to be embarrassed on their home field again.
Absolutely not, Sean. And I think the excitement around this program is, I think it's a long time coming, to be honest. Toward the end of the Scott Frost era, especially 2021 and 22, you kind of saw an apathy from players and fans alike. It was kind of a feeling of hopelessness and just, let's get to a bowl game. Certainly, they fell short of that last year in pretty inexplicable ways. Losing the game to Minnesota early in the year, losing even a questionable game to Iowa toward at the very conclusion of their season last year. Everything is going to be on Dylan Raiola this year. He is someone they have targeted since 2022, which is insane to say, considering that Raiola is a freshman this year. Raiola probably had one of the most interesting recruitments of all time. Originally went Ohio State. Ohio State proclaimed him the savior. Well, not savior. Proclaimed him the next big thing, because Ohio State didn't need saving by any means. Then he commits to Georgia, and then he finally flips back to Nebraska, where there's plenty of family history, the dad, the uncle, you name it. He is a Nebraska Cornhusker by blood. I think this is more of a house money year for Nebraska, should they make a bowl game, considering Raiola is in it for the long run, considering the NIL he's getting and the family ties. I think I give him a less than 10% chance of ever leaving there. I love the fact that Nash I can't pronounce his last name. Hutmacher is back, one of the premier defensive tackles in college football, for a nose tackle too. I think him and Mason Graham are probably going to be your All Big Ten finalists this year. So Sean, a lot of returning pieces, a lot of new pieces as well. I think 7-0 going into Columbus, I hate to be this guy, is on the table. Do I think it's going to happen? No, but Sean, this team getting back to a bowl should be the bare minimum. What do you think?
Yeah, they can't take a step back. And
No.
a step back, if they have the same season as they did last year, I still think that's a step back because their expectations are so high, and they have a favorable schedule here to win some football games, and they could be 10-2. Now that's not going to be enough for the college football playoff, but I could see this team being ranked at some points of the year, especially if they start off 7-0. Like you said, they'll have a low number next to their name at the horseshoe on 26th, but um, you know maybe for the first time in a while they actually have a chance of meeting their expectations, and it's sort of long overdue for Nebraska because they still pack the stadium, they still have great support, but they haven't really had much to cheer about really 5, 6, 7 years. So they're definitely the most intriguing team that we're going to talk about today in terms of ceiling because I think it's pretty high.
Totally,
Now,
Sean.
now, Joe, we're going to move on to the other newcomer from Los Angeles. That's the USC Trojans. Lincoln Riley is back for another year, and Caleb Williams is out of town. The Heisman Trophy winner is now playing on Sundays for the Chicago Bears. USC, after a terribly disappointing season last year in the Pac-12, they move to their new conference. They start off on prime time against LSU, and then their opener in the Big Ten is at the Big House against Michigan. So they do start off the season ranked. They're coming off a tough year last year by their standards, and they're going to get the brunt of it early on here. Penn State not too far on in the season on the famous October 12th, and then they end the year with Notre Dame. So a tough schedule for USC as they head over to the Big Ten.
Sean, I do think it's a tough schedule. I think it's a workable one, though, with the gaps they have in between, particularly after that famous October 12th. I do like this team, and I say I like this team roster-wise and the personnel moves they've made on the coaching staff. I think bringing in D'Anton Lynn from UCLA, who got that defense together, is a step in the right direction, a massive step in the right direction overall for Lincoln Riley, who I think, in a way, his loyalty, kind of the way Mark D'Antonio, who ran the conference from about 2011 to 2015, I think his loyalty to guys like Alex Grinch is what's been his biggest downfall, especially in the early years at USC. I think hiring Lynn shows an adaptability. Now, ultimately, the result is up in the air. We have no idea what it's going to be. I don't question whether this offense is going to be elite. I think anytime Lincoln Riley has trotted a team out there from his days as a play caller at ECU, he's not had an offense that hadn't been in the top 15 in all combined offensive categories, which is pretty impressive to have that run from 2014 to 2024 across ECU, Oklahoma, and USC, because we all know who's really calling the plays. That's one Lincoln Riley. So questioning the offense is a waste of everyone's time. And Miller Moss, especially the performance he put out against Louisville, I think will be an effective quarterback, and with weapons like Zachariah Branch. It is all on the defense this year, Sean, for what USC is going to be. Because their spread, I see them winning anywhere from 6 to 11 games. They have the talent to win 11 games. Do they have the execution to win 11 games? Or do they have the execution of a team that's probably going to disappoint and go win 7 or 8 games? Because at USC, they're not in the Big Ten to necessarily win the conference every year.
They want to
They're
make
there
the
to be
football. They want to make the college football playoff. That's for
Yeah.
sure.
They want to be in the top 4 of the Big Ten conference, and they certainly want to be in the playoff more often than they're not. So we'll see if it happens. Certainly, their schedule, the first 3 games, 2 of them, you could go 1 for 2 in those 2 big games, and you could make a massive statement to the entire country. Because there will be no games on besides their game against LSU on Sunday, September 1st. And beating the defending national champions at home in a 3:30 CBS game, that would make a statement all of college football would have to take notice to. So USC can quickly get rid of the bad 2023 they've had in early as September. I think a lot of people would have short memories should that happen. But even if they lose those two games, Sean, I think the Penn State Notre Dame games, I could easily see them picking one of those two teams off. And if you put a gun to my head, I think they do.
Yeah, both of those are at home, Joe, as you said it. And one thing really sticks out to me about this USC schedule, and that is two road games pretty much against northern old Big Ten teams. That's Michigan and Minnesota on October 5th. They might not have like a crazy bad weather game. Now Washington is on November 2nd, but they've played them before. They should know what the situation's going to be up there in Washington. But you know, maybe it could snow in Maryland on October 19th, but it's certainly not snowing on the 23rd against UCLA. They're home against Nebraska Northwestern. I don't see like a crazy bad weather game coming for USC now. It's months out and crazier things have happened, but that certainly is a good sign for the USC offense because you get these rainy, snowy games and you can't throw the ball and you can't kick the ball. That might throw them off their game a little bit, but I don't see one on the schedule. That's just something that I looked out for and didn't see it.
Yeah, Sean. And Mike Leach's probably greatest disciple coaching wise is Lincoln Riley in terms of results on the field. And he does honor him. I know he's taken that air raid offense and put his own spin on it. The bottom line with any air raid offense, in the cold, it's not as easy to operate as it is in the warm. I don't think even the most loyal SEC or West Coast football fan would try to argue that. So, Sean, what defines success for USC? I think getting 9 wins would be a definite success because that would imply they pick off one of LSU, Michigan, Penn State, and Notre Dame. I think that would show the fans that the program was willing to adapt, and it immediately worked, leaving them open to be probably one of the hottest teams going into the offseason in 2025. I do not see a situation where Lincoln Riley is remotely on the hot seat after this season. I think he is one of the higher paid coaches in college football, but just because he is he doesn't mean he should get like scorching hot seat for going at 8-4 on a pretty difficult schedule with a new starting quarterback. So I think it's interesting. I'm going to go the middle ground for USC. I do think they'll finish 9-3. I bet you they pick off one of those big four. And if you had told me right now, I think they beat both Penn State and Notre Dame, and they lose some dumb game like at Minnesota or at Washington, or even a home game to Nebraska to get the third loss. But I do think this team has a lot of good pieces. And with D'Anton Lynn, they figure out the defense by October. And then 2025, everyone's wondering what they're up to.
Yeah, I don't know if college football playoff is possible. I mean, maybe they have the big games enough to be at least in the conversation with 2 losses, but that comes with no hiccups. But also, Utah State is your easiest game. You got LSU and Notre Dame as your 2 other non-conference games. They're scheduling tough, and they're certainly not shying away from any of that. Now, Joe, we got 3 teams left here. First, we're going to talk about the Wisconsin Badgers. Luke Fickell is back as coach. Last year, mired in mediocrity, some losses to some teams at home that they were much better than. They did actually also win a couple games that they probably shouldn't have. They start off with 2 very easy games against Western Michigan and South Dakota, but then on Saturday the 14th, they host Alabama before going to the previously mentioned USC. No Michigan on the schedule. No Ohio State on the schedule. They do have Oregon plus Alabama, so it's still definitely tough. But Wisconsin looking at a little bit of a different look this year compared to the previous ones.
Yeah, Sean, and like a lot of these teams, they get an immediate baptism by fire with Alabama. Yes, without Nick Saban, but Kalen DeBoer, any objective fan would put him in the top 5 of their current active college football coaches. Sean, this is probably as big a second year as any coach in the country could have. Luke Fickell, I don't think the hire itself shocked anyone in December of 22. I think what shocked people was the offensive approach he chose with offensive coordinator Longo. I do not believe that is Wisconsin football. What I will say is I think people forget Ches Malusi, who will be back this year, got injured 4 games or 5 games into last season, and he was looking really good in that new offense. I think that Wisconsin's play calling utilized him very effectively. I think him being fully healthy is something that Wisconsin's going to have to hope for the whole year. I do think Tyler Van Dyke is an effective enough quarterback. I don't think he's going to light the world on fire by any means. But you also added Tommy Walker, the old Oklahoma running back. He rushed for over 500 yards last year for the Sooners. So I do think them running the ball this year is on the table a lot more than people would think. I think they're going to be forced to in a lot of these games, especially in games where they might have to rely on their defense. I'm worried about this team's defensive line, Sean. That's my only concern. They lost a lot of depth last year to the portal. I do not believe that they're going to get gashed in a lot of games. What I do think is that they could lose a war of attrition should they be trailing by 7 going into a half, and you play a team like Penn State and Iowa that has no problem playing hot potato, especially if you turn the ball over. So Wisconsin's another team with volatile expectations. I think, you could view their season in the way you viewed I believe it was Northwestern's season, where your first half is the 2 ranked games, and then you get some breathing room, and then another gauntlet from the 26th of October to November 16th. But Sean, what did you take away from the caffeine-filled rant I just gave you there?
So we've talked about how the middle class here in the Big Ten might be very crowded, and what this Wisconsin team just screams out middle class to me: 7-5, 6-6, 5-7 range. I don't think they'll get dragged beyond, let's say, the bottom. I don't think they'll be dragged into the bottom third, but I think they're gonna have to put something really special together to get into the top third. It's a lot of tough games. You can't really see them winning more than one. I know all 3 of them are at home, which is big. 3 of their top 10 games, I can't see them winning more than one. Maybe they get a road Iowa or road USC win, but still, we're still looking at 9 wins, even with 3 losses. So I think it'll be really tough for them to get out of the middle. It's just too many good teams on their schedule.
Yeah, Sean, and middle class is not what Wisconsin's wanted to hear because Luke Fickell was hired in 2022, a year after it was known that USC and UCLA were coming here, and the rumblings were out there that Oregon and Washington would follow suit. You don't make that kind of hire with a guy that was probably the hottest name in the coaching cycle from the offseason of 2020 to 2022 if you want to be middle class. I do think that's unfair to put on Luke Fickell in year 2, where, let's face it, at the end, Paul Chryst didn't leave him way too much. I understand Fickell could have utilized the portal as any other coach could have, but this wasn't like a Brett Bielema to Gary Anderson, or even a Gary Anderson to Paul Chryst kind of handoff. You didn't hand Luke Fickell a product of a team that would win 10 games. I really don't believe that. I do think this is on him to elevate it this year from a team that won 7 games. Certainly, anything better than that is in the right direction. I just think Wisconsin fans want a bigger jump than what might be realistic for this year. So I think tempering those expectations to a degree is fine. I just think you should hold him to the standard of improvement, especially in year 2 with a better quarterback and year 2 of the play calling system. So one of the more interesting teams and one of the more interesting fan bases we'll see in this conference this year, Sean.
Look, you don't put Alabama on the schedule if you think your team's going to stink. And, even if this was years out, I'm not super familiar with college football non-conference scheduling, whether these things come together quickly or years and years in advance. I think these high-profile ones certainly are years in advance, but you got that game, obviously the tough Big Ten games, as we said. I just think the step that they want, they might be better. They might be significantly better than some other teams with 8 wins, but I think they are a victim of a really tough schedule. They get Rutgers on the road, Iowa on the road, Nebraska on the road. You can see the other team being favored in all of those, actually. And depending on what happens, you get a couple of, your home games aren't that easy either. Other than Purdue, you'll be significant favorites, but you've got the Penn States, Oregon, and rivalry Minnesota at home to end the season. This is a tough, tough schedule for Wisconsin, and them seeing a jump in the wins department might not be realistic, really, at all, actually. But we'll go to our second to last team here, Joe, and that is Illinois. Bielema is back for another year in Champaign. Been certainly a mixed bag for them over the years. Now, a step into the middle class might be what Illinois is looking for this year. They host a ranked Kansas. Now, this is the return game from last year. The whole Terrence Shannon saga came when Illinois went to Kansas last year for football. If you're a basketball fan, that's how that whole thing started. Kansas returns the game this year. They get Eastern and Central before Big Ten play. And then you start off with two tough road games. You get Michigan, you get Oregon. But after that, you have those two tough games at the end of October. But you have some winnable games after that. So Illinois, what are you looking for from the Illini this year?
I'm looking for probably just a bowl appearance, to be honest, Sean. I don't think Bielema enters the year in any way close to the hot seat, especially the overperformance they had in 2021 and 2022. Last year was a disappointment. I don't care how you write it. I think you didn't bring Luke Altmaier in from Ole Miss if you didn't expect to at least have another year of competing toward the top of the Big Ten West Conference, which was a semi-expectation they had. I don't think they meant it in terms of they had to be in the top two, but certainly being out of the race by the middle of October was not looking pretty hapless on offense, by the way, in September too, was not on their agenda. Sean, they have one of the more interesting QB situations. I like both of their quarterbacks between Altmaier and John Paddock. I think both those guys last year, the 6 games each they started, showed a lot. Altmaier showed he has dual threat ability. I think he got his interceptions under control after that Penn State game. I do think he sold that game a lot more than people are going to discredit him for. I think they should utilize that as much as possible. I think this is a year, especially for teams that are going to enter the playoff, where QB depth is going to be more important than ever. That's why I kind of look at Oregon and look at Ohio State. Although well, maybe not Oregon. Although Will Howard might not be the best starter ever in the conference, having a guy like Julian Sand, who was one of the better QBs in the 2023 cycle, 2024 cycle rather, is nothing to scoff at, nor is Arch Manning, Quinn Ewers at Texas. The point being, Sean, I don't think this is a team that an injury at QB completely derails their expectations. Now, that schedule is very tough, and the only good thing about it is the end of the year is very soft compared to the first 8 games. I think 6 wins is definitely on the table for Bielema. He's someone who's always overperformed, whether it was at Wisconsin, his early tenure at Arkansas, and his ability to just figure out defense. I don't think their D-line is great. It's probably it's probably the weakest it's been in his tenure at Illinois, which is really shocking in year 4. But it is worth noting, Sean, that in many of these games, aside from the 3 ranked games, there's a path to victory in a lot of them, especially with good QB play, which I think they'll get, whether it's Altmaier or Paddock starting. So,
they didn't make things easy last year. They had 5 wins, just won by more than a field goal. Now, they also lost a couple of close games, lost big in others, but when you play a lot of close games, there's a way that you win, you get lucky, you win them all, and you get 7 wins. If that is the way that they play this year. Now, you also could win less and lose a bunch of close games, and they only beat Florida Atlantic by 6, Toledo by 3 last year. So you certainly want to see them take care of Eastern Illinois and Central Michigan rather handily, get a big lead, get the starters out of the game, that sort of thing. But, you get a home game against Kansas, that's turned, that is a rivalry. So you got a chance to pick up a big win even before you step on the field for Big Ten play. So another momentum team for me, a lot of toss-up games. There's a world where 3/4 of these toss-up games go their way and they get 6-7 wins.
Couldn't agree more, Sean. And I do think between them and Wisconsin, I give Wisconsin more of a chance to pick off one of these upsets. I think USC is the most likely of all the teams we previewed tonight to pull off a top 10 upset. But Brett Bielema is a guy that stunned a lot of people. I can't think of a more stunning win in his tenure at Illinois than the 2021 victory against Penn State in that awful, like, 7 or 9 OT game that should never be shown to anyone unless they're someone getting tortured trying to give up secrets.
Yeah,
So, yeah,
that was hard to watch, that game. I
yeah.
do remember tuning in, and multiple times I said, is this game really not over yet? Because they kept tying, they kept penalty shootout, triple, quadruple overtiming, matching each other, whether it was scoring the 2-point conversion or not. But I think we talked about this Wisconsin being a step down from Rutgers. I think Illinois is a step down from Wisconsin in terms of, good season, probably 6-7 wins versus Wisconsin 7-8 versus Rutgers is 8-9. So that's how I see it, at least for the Fighting Illini. Now here's the last schedule that we'll talk about tonight, Joe, and that is the winners of the last Big Ten West. That was through no fault of their own. They actually looked like they tried to lose some games last year. That's the Iowa Hawkeyes, the ugliest football team maybe ever. But you got to go back before the forward pass was invented to find a team that struggled this much. But to their credit, they won football games. They found ways. They're back. Cade McNamara is back after his injury. They do start off with their non-conference slate being Illinois State, their rivalry game against Iowa State, and then Troy. And then they roll into the Big Ten with 2 road games. You get Ohio State, you avoid Oregon, you avoid Michigan, and you avoid Penn State. One of the easier Big Ten schedules that we've seen here for the Hawkeyes.
Sean, this is the easiest schedule by far we have seen across our preview part 1 and our preview part 2. I think a lot of the reasons why people are picking Iowa as a sleeper, I really don't think it has a lot to do with what we're going to talk about, which has plenty of substance to it. It's because they play one team that's currently ranked in the AP Top 25.
And these other teams, Joe, are not knocking on the door either of the
No.
top 25. I mean, maybe one of them, maybe Wisconsin, but, it's not like that. Iowa is near the back of the rankings, and there will be a number of Big Ten teams in that, let's say, 20 to 30 range, where some of them will be ranked one week and then others will be ranked the next week. But these teams that they're playing aren't really in that range, and those are the toss-up games.
Yeah, Sean, and I understand their over-under is at 7.5. Betting the over on Iowa over-unders has been a trademark of conservative betting, especially if you want to do futures over the last 7 years. So, with that said, Sean, the biggest storyline of the offseason, and no, it wasn't Kirk Ferentz getting suspended, and I'm shocked it took the NCAA that long, considering Cade and Eric All, who transferred from Michigan, both very good college players, I will add, kind of admitted, yeah, he called me up before I even entered the portal. I think that was a slip on their part, or maybe a slip on Iowa's part for telling them to not telling them to leave that part out when talking to the media, podcasters, whatever. Tim Lester has to show up for Iowa this year if they want to make the playoff. And it's crazy for me to put that on Iowa right now. I don't think that's the expectation by any means. But it's more than realistic, Sean, when you look at the schedule. Phil Parker returns to the defensive coordinator. Yes, they lose Cooper DeJean. But, Sean, the defense, we know, that's a constant. It's kind of like the James Franklin thing to an even higher degree.
They'll have a chance to win every game, even the Ohio State game.
Yeah, and if you remember the 2022 Ohio State game at the Horseshoe, they were in that game just because their defense, Jack Campbell in particular, was saving them so many times. It was just Padilla and Petrus trying to give the ball away to Ohio State because I guess they did not like playing offense at all, which with that offense you could kind of understand. Sean, I do think, I really believe returning to Indianapolis is not far-fetched at all. Are they one of the 2 best teams? No. But do they have the best schedule that allows that? Yes.
11-1, certainly looks attainable via they're just better than some of these teams. And look, I think there's one game where they're not favorites. Now, that doesn't mean they're going to win 11 games, but they're road games where they possibly could trip up. Now, Ohio State game aside, Minnesota, Michigan State, UCLA, Maryland, they're better than those teams. Now, the worst teams can win home games, especially when they get their crowds into it. But the Washingtons, the Nebraskas, at home, they should be favored in those games too. If Iowa plays the same that they did last year, they might get 10 wins, and that's pretty crazy considering that their safety, who's also their punt returner, was their biggest threat offensively, especially towards the latter half of last year. But if they just make the smallest of improvements, even maybe into, I don't even say average, just not horrendous offense, I think they probably win a lot of games this year.
Totally, Sean. And I'm going to be really upfront. There's a chance they could make the Big Ten title game at 10-2. Now, not 2 losses in the conference. I think Iowa State is, as of now, is by far their second hardest game with Rocco Beck back, Matt Campbell. But Kirk Ferentz kind of owns Iowa State, so I'm expecting Iowa to win that game, especially it being a home game. I think a lot of people make reference to Cade McNamara's 7 for 21 performance in their scrimmage. I think a lot of that still is the defense. I think last year it's a shame he went down at the end of September because he is a solid quarterback. He's a Big Ten championship winning quarterback by his words alone. So, Sean, I think Cade kind of shows out this year, not in terms of a crazy performance that gets him draftable, but a performance that shows that he is an elite game manager and a cerebral quarterback, which is what he was trademarked for at Michigan before JJ inevitably took over. So, I think this is a team that will be in the hunt for the Big Ten title game until November. What happens from there, I do not know because of how crazy Wisconsin, UCLA, and Nebraska could be. So, Sean, I hate to say it, I think they overachieved the 7.5.
For sure.
And I do think teams are going to watch their games, not because they like their style of football, but because they're going to be forced to, since they're going to be in the Big Ten championship game hunt.
So, official predictions and power rankings will come next week, as no team in the Big Ten plays in Week 0. There is a game between Georgia Tech and Florida State this week that is in Dublin, but we'll do all that next week. But sounds like, Joe, that you think it's going to be Oregon versus Iowa for the Big Ten championship.
I don't want to say it, but
no, we'll come prepared with our locked in guesses next week. But how about that? That would be something, wouldn't it? the Pac-12 newbies versus the everything that's wrong with the Big Ten team. But it's going to come down to now. Here's the one thing about Iowa that the fans might not be super happy about in terms of the college football playoff. There's little room for error with how easy their schedule is. A 2-loss Iowa, for example, might not even be in if the loss comes to a team that isn't very good. And then, like you said, there's the Ohio State game, but there's not really another needle-moving win on there. Might help them come Big Ten championship time, but it certainly won't come college football playoff selection. But that's probably the only negative from this. Iowa, they still made it to the Big Ten championship last year, but my goodness, they were hard to watch. I think they underachieved from where their expectations were, and I think for them just to turn the page on last year and to even look forward to maybe average quarterback play. Is it possible for Iowa fans to be excited about this season? I think it is.
I think it definitely is. And, should they beat Iowa State, I think a lot of people are going to rank them in the top 25, including the AP poll. And maybe that game in Columbus becomes interesting. And then from there, people are going to take Iowa seriously as a Big Ten championship game contender. Notice how I'm trying to not say title contender.
Yeah, I would think if they go up against a Michigan or a rematch against Ohio State or an Oregon or USC, maybe there'd be significant underdogs in that one for sure. But, Joe, that's all we have from today. Just over the hour mark. Obviously, a lot to talk about between the 9 teams we discussed today. Next week, we'll get into our official power rankings, who we think will make it to Indianapolis, And then this time next week, Joe, we'll be previewing the Week 1 games, which shouldn't be too difficult other than a few for the Big Ten, but we'll get into the preview weeks and then recap weeks at the beginning of the following week. So thank you, everybody, for tuning in to this episode of the In a Nutshell podcast. We'll see you